talk a little about what we don't understand about this book. Um, that'll take a while. Um, I don't know if anybody really knows what the title of this book is talking about. Yeah, it comes from a Bible verse. But so what? Who understands what that Bible verse means? The violent bear it away. Uh, what's the it? Well, apparently from the Bible verse, it's the kingdom of heaven. So, uh, this is a title and a book that's saying violence is good for you? I don't really think so. There are people who are willing to argue that, oh yeah, this is a very pro-violence book, and old Tarwater shooting at Rayburn is a great thing because his soul is in the right place. I don't really buy that. But I haven't heard very many people argue that the novel isn't an endorsement of violence. The people who design book covers for new editions of The Violent Bear It Away seem always to be eager to put images of violence, guns, fire on the covers. So I think they're just taking it for granted that, of course, this is a very pro shoot 'em up um, text. Gary Ciuba, I'm never quite sure how to pronounce the man's name, wrote a long article, a long chapter of his book one time that argues that no, the book's not an endorsement of violence. It's the violence is violence directed against the self in order to tame its improper impulses. That's what the violence is. That's what the good violence is, and it doesn't involve a gun. Well, okay, maybe Gary's right. I don't see a whole bunch of people saying, "Oh yeah, thank goodness Gary finally explained what the title of this book means." Flannery can be a little perverse and stick a title on there that is intentionally shocking, and it sure looks like it's an endorsement of violence, but I consider it a bit of a puzzle. I am similarly puzzled by the word tar water. I keep waiting for somebody to explain to me that tar water is a term for moonshine. That would make sense to me. Or tar water is a term for turpentine. Um, that would kind of make sense. That tar water is a reference to swamp water, and it's got something to do with the Okefenokee swamp. Um, I'm still not sure. I know it's been pointed out to me repeatedly that um, tar and water don't mix. So it's got to be a reference to things that are at odds with themselves. And it may be a descriptor of the characters who carry that name, that they're self-contradictory. But I'm I've only been working on this novel for 40 years, so I'm still waiting for the puzzle pieces to fit together. Now, let's add to that um, I'm not sure if the character we call Tarwater is actually named Tarwater. Check this as you read the second half. But I, I, I occasionally try drawing out the family tree of of the characters from those early pages, and I think I have decided that our main character is named Francis Raber, and he just doesn't want to admit that Raber is his last name, so he calls himself Tarwater. So you might put Tarwater in that long list of O'Connor characters who have chosen their own names. And sometimes in criticism, characters get um, condemned for presuming to name themselves as if that's always a self-deceptive lie. You know, people say terrible things about Holga naming herself, but maybe Tarwater is in the same boat. So he's somebody who chose to give himself the name that implies that he is self-contradictory. Well, that makes things clear, doesn't it? Um, okay, so maybe a theme for tonight is um, can we find anybody in this novel that we can really trust? And maybe we can, but this book challenges us to question the reliability and the truthfulness of the voices coming at us about as much as anything Flannery O'Connor ever um, wrote. And and I include in that list of people we might not trust Flannery O'Connor, who said things like, she is totally on the side of old Tarwater. She agrees with him about everything totally. Well, you really want to shoot your relatives? Maybe she did, but I don't really think she's going to be serious about that if you put her on the spot. But she said it, you know, that everything old Tarwater does and says, she's for it. She also says, and I question this too, that the devil in this book is the real devil. And she was totally opposed to looking at the stranger's voice, the devil in the book, as some sort of psychological tendency within young Tarwater. Well, I think the devil's voice is some kind of psychological tendency in young Tarwater. And I think, uh, what's going on here that Flannery says things about her text? I mean, I love Flannery, but she says things that I think are just not quite true. I'm going to be a little argumentative with Flannery tonight. I think it makes it a better novel. Okay, let's get that straight. It's a very complicated novel, and there's lots to think about, lots of ways to read it. And when I did my dissertation, the major theorist I used for inspiration was Mikhail Bakhtin, who said every every novel is a battleground, and everybody is at odds with everybody else. And the most an author can possibly do is kind of play conductor and try to make some kind of harmony out of all the competing voices that are joining the chorus. And Bakhtin said, um, even the author is just one more set of opinions. And, that's what the novel is something that invites us to listen to all the different opinions that are being thrown at us and kind of make up our own minds about what we're going to make of them and whom we're going to trust. So um, I've struggled with this a lot, but I think Flannery knows that her novel is better if there's some question about whether the author is totally in control of the situation. And part of this, I think, she gets from reading Dostoevsky. Okay, Standing Behind the Violent Buried Away is the great Russian novel, The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. And it's very clear that to some extent, um, the inspiration for the middle of the novel is um, Ivan Karamazov. He is Raber. Raber is Ivan Karamazov. Okay. Um, in the Brothers Karamazov, and I'm going to make this very confusing. Okay, trust me, it's all going to be about how you can't be sure what's going on here. In the Brothers Karamazov, I think finally, it is a very Christian novel, and yet Dostoevsky creates this character Ivan, who persuades many readers that Dostoevsky's really on his side. What does Ivan do? He says over and over and over that he wants nothing to do with a God who would allow children to be abused. He even keeps a notebook where he puts newspaper clippings for every story he can find about terrible things that people have done to children. And he collects them and reviews them as his proof that, yeah, there's a God, but he's no good. I'm not on his team. And he says that over and over and over and over. And I don't think Ivan ever changes his mind about that. I mean, it's been a while since I've read The Brothers Karamazov. Um, and there's some people who say, well, Dostoevsky's a great novelist because he allows you to decide that Ivan is right, even though Ivan is not really the character who speaks for Dostoevsky. It's probably Alyosha, the really religious um, character. He's probably the one who's saying what Dostoevsky believes. But a lot of people have read the novel and say, you know, the great creation is Ivan, and he ends up getting a lot of really a lot of really good lines. So this is a source of um, additional confusion that we're not sure how to take Raber. Um, Flannery complained that, you know, readers are no good. They'll just end up agreeing with Raber, and she didn't like that idea, and that's not what she wanted. She wanted everybody to be on the side of of old Tarwater. Okay, you're on the side of the person who shoots instead of the person who gets shot. And I think, you know, some days Flannery felt like that, but other days the writer might have had different thoughts. And, you know, sometimes writers write things that they didn't quite intend. And I think that's um, kind of the territory we're in. Okay. Oh, what else? What else is confusing? This book has Flannery's major, not only use of the devil. And she said, it's the real devil. It's not just some psychological tendency in the character who hears the devil talking. And there are other devils in Flannery O'Connor. Um, but this is the main one. And she wanted it to be perceived as the real devil. And I've gotten into arguments about this, but with people who are perfectly reasonable, sane people who are good readers of literature and all that, and I just find that I disagree with them, and I'm on the side that says, no, this is not the real devil. I've read passages in Dostoevsky where he talks about the devil, and I'm more persuaded that he's talking about the real devil in that text. And Flannery is doing something else, which is to um, have a character create a devil to express his own wicked, evil, rebellious thoughts, which he's going to get over by the end of the book. But it's a source of confusion. And and Flannery has these real strong opinions that she would, tell anybody who asked about how we were supposed to read it. And yet I think the novel invites us to see it um, as more complicated than um, she told us. One way to read the, I mean, I guess I'll wrap this train of thought up by saying one way to read The Violent Buried Away is that Flannery O'Connor is trying to answer Ivan Karamazov. What? You're going to say God's no good? I'm going to answer that character in that Dostoevsky novel, and I'm going to do it through my version of Ivan Karamazov, whom I'm calling Raber. Does that work? I'm going to say, not really. I'm going to say I love Flannery O'Connor. She's a great writer in lots of ways, devoted years and years and years to her, and I think she's the greatest. And yet, I think she didn't do it. Of course, who could? You'd have to solve the problem of evil altogether, and people have been debating that for an awfully long time. But that's like at the end of the page, the end of the section really gives me throws that issue about Raber and Ivan Karamazov in our faces. So let's that go. Let's let that go. I've started out with a bunch of stuff about why this is a really um, confusing novel. Okay, my usual way to start talking about any text we do in book club is to talk a little bit about the the composition history, the publication history. And I got a little bit of a surprise by looking at the facts about when this book was composed and published. And I've always had this data in front of me. I don't know why it didn't go in. She published the first chapter of The Violent Buried Away as a short story called You Can't Be Any Poorer Than Dead, as a short story. And she published it the same year she published A Good Man Is Hard to Find in Other Stories. So she was starting to write this novel before she finished A Good Man Is Hard to Find. Um, and it took her a lot of years to finish this. And so this is not a great departure from what she had done earlier. She was working on The Violent Buried Away before she wrote any of the stories that ended up in Everything That Rises Must Converge, her posthumous collection. And I don't know, that surprises me. That surprises me a little bit. So when I looked it up in the collected stories, the complete stories, and I said, "Oh, gee, You Can't Be Any Poorer Than Dead appeared in 1955. Why don't you finally break down, Bruce, and just read the first chapter as if it were a standalone short story? What effect does that have on you?" And I gave myself a bit of a jolt, which was to say, "Darn, this sounds like she is imitating William Faulkner." If you've ever read the story Barn Burning, I'd say, well, the way that first chapter ends, a little boy who thinks he's rebelling against his, um, you know, father figure, but we're being told it's not going to work. He's going to be haunted, obsessed by what he's rebelled against for the rest of his life. Well, we're in the same situation as Barn Burning. And, you know, both the story and the first chapter have to do with burning and what that means. And it's an act that kind of um, opposes, has an issue about how do you feel about your father figure. So that was a surprise to me to even have that thought, because I have never thought that Flannery O'Connor was trying to write like William Faulkner after she wrote some little passages of stream of consciousness for the early drafts of Wise Blood. There's stuff where she's on the train with Hazel Motes and she's trying to write really experimental, artsy stream of consciousness stuff. And then she gave that up. But then I read this from, the mid 50s when she's well into her career, and I start to think this sounds a little bit like Faulkner. And when I am doing my little family tree, trying to figure out what's Tarwater's name really, and how are these people related to each other, I feel just like I'm stuck in a Faulkner novel where I don't know what the hell is going on and I don't know who these people are and they all have to seem to have the same name. And the author is intentionally trying to um, confuse me about what's going on so that I let go a certain rational function about what literature is supposed to offer me. So I kind of find myself in I kind of find myself in um, Faulkner land where the past never leaves. And I don't usually say that about Flannery O'Connor. I usually say about Flannery O'Connor that she thinks the world was created in 1945 and everything is about what came after World War II. But, there were times in Flannery's career where she said, I'm in a rut, I need to try something different. And maybe one of the things she tried was to um, imitate the author that everybody was going to compare her to as her career went on, William Faulkner, whom she didn't often try to um, imitate. Now, I'm going to transition into a theme that relates to this, and it's about human freedom. Faulkner said, that you can't escape the past. It never even is past. That everything is about how the past controls the present and the future. And we're just kidding ourselves to think it's anything other than that. That's a debate in both Wise Blood and The Violent Buried Away. Both of our big novels are about the mystery of human freedom. And do we have any? Is Hazel Motes ever free to make a choice about anything important in the course of Wise Blood? I would say yes. Is Tarwater able to make choices for himself, or is he just possessed by old Tarwater, the old man, and just totally controlled by him? I had a student one time who wrote a master's thesis arguing that both Wise Blood and The Violent Buried Away are novels of demonic possession, tragedies of demonic possession, and that there is no freedom left. There are terrible tales. And I promise you, I brought up every argument I could think of for why that's not true. And I was told I was wrong and that this person was going to write what he thought. And he knew a lot about the demonic possession and exorcism and the stages of demonic possession. And golly gee, I waved the flag of defeat and I said, okay, maybe that's one more way to read both of these novels, is that the devils are just flying around all over the place and maybe they win sometimes. Can I put anything past Flannery O'Connor? And I finally say, well, maybe. Um, that famous introduction that Flannery wrote for the second edition of Wise Blood, the thing she had to write so she could get it re-copyrighted. You could just as easily apply to The Violent Buried Away, which she was publishing at about the same time she wrote that introduction. It's just about the tangles of human freedom. And if people are Christian, it's almost in spite of themselves. Well, you could say that about Tarwater just as easily, and Raber, and maybe Old Tartar, just as easily as you could say it about Hazel Motes in Wise Blood. Human freedom is tricky. There are all sorts of things that make you question whether it's even really possible. And Flannery is talking about it and pretty conscious of that, and open to the possibility that there's no freedom there. Although I think there is. I mean, that's how I read both the novels, and I think she wanted me to read it that way. But, she lets the opposing view get in there all over the place. Okay, let's see, where are we next? Okay, changing the subject a little bit. When I have taught this novel over the years, I always get the comment from students that uh, usually what's wrong with this novel is that there aren't any women in it. It's just guys, guys, guys being ridiculous, and it's all about testosterone poisoning, and they're just too male. And what they need is the female principal in here. And what is it about Flannery that she can't put it in there? Okay, maybe she had a problem. I think that I'm willing to put a lot of emphasis on little disabled Lucette Carmody as enough of a female principal to say femaleness is really quite a good thing. Um, I think at the end of the novel, don't want to give it away, at the end of the novel, there is the possibility that part of what is um, going to attract Tarwater in his future choices after the novel ends is what he associates with Lucette Carmody, and the fact that she's female and young is going to be very important. And there are other women in the novel, and people make fun of Bishop's mother, Bernice Bishop, because old Tarwater makes fun of her. But there are a couple of other women, and watching over the proceedings and expressing their opinions, and I find myself trusting them. So I don't think um, I don't think this is an anti-woman novel. I think it's a novel in which we get to hear a lot of men express how much they hate women and they don't understand women. And oh, by the way, while we're talking about women, let's talk about the concept of the whore. Um, my main argument that Tarwater's devil, his stranger, his friend, isn't really the devil is that Tarwater doesn't know what old Tarwater is talking about when old Tarwater calls women whores. Tarwater doesn't seem to know what that is. And he's having a conversation with his stranger, with the friend. And if this is my argument, if the devil really wanted to corrupt Tarwater, if he wanted his soul, an easy strategy would be to say, oh, let me tell you about whores. Let me say all sorts of bad things about women. And let me tell you the truth that you don't understand, kid. That is not what the devil's voice does. He says, after Tarwater says almost nothing about what that term means, he says, oh, yeah, I guess you understand that enough. And to me, that's like case closed. This is Tarwater telling himself that he understands what old Tarwater is about when he says terrible things about women, and he doesn't really understand what old Tarwater is saying. So there, I've now disagreed with a whole bunch of people who've written about this novel and Flannery O'Connor herself, and I say, yeah, this is about young Tarwater's psychological development. He has got a lot of problems, and part two is about whether we can believe he is solving any of these psychological problems. He has psychological, spiritual, you name it, problems. Is he going to be okay? Let me remind you, I supervised a master's thesis that beat me over the head with the idea that Tar water is demonically possessed, and this is a tragedy about people whose lives are ruined who are telling themselves that they're right with God at the end. Golly gee, um, amazing that I can't shoot that down any better than I can. Okay, changing the subject again. Um, I just said a bit about Lucette, and there's much more to say about Lucette. Um, I just said a bit about Lucette. I will also say that one of the things that's important about Lucette is the same thing that is important about Tarwater and Bishop, that they're children, they're kids. And core belief, I'm sure of, in The Violent Bear It Away and in most of O'Connor, is it's a whole lot better to be a child than to be an adult. Adults are just pretty consistently messed up. And the adult mind is just a big liar. And, uh, you know, you must become a child again, she believed through and through. And one way she does that in the opening pages here, I mean, indirectly, is to make everybody an idiot. I I traced it down, wrote down the page numbers. Old Tarwater is compared to an idiot. Raber is compared to an idiot. Bishop, of course, is called an idiot many times, and young Tarwater is called an idiot. And why? Because, as Old Tarwater says, that's God's way to protect you from growing up and being corrupted. If you're an idiot, then you don't have to go to school, for one thing, and be acculturated in ways you don't want to be acculturated. And I think there, I agree. I mean, I think that Flannery is that's where Flannery's going, I think. I think she's very, very, very pro-child. Of course, that makes her very uh, conscious that she's in danger of stacking the deck. If her children are charming, we might think that this is sappy. We might think that this is sentimental, phony. So, innocence takes the form of mental disability. It takes the form of being a real brat, um, like Tarwater is. And excuse me, there are just many moments in this book where I say to myself, gosh, if I were Raber, I wouldn't be nearly as nice to Tarwater as Raber is. And I know the novel is satirizing Raber in 65 ways. But if I were in charge of this child, I would not be so open-minded and forgiving as he forces himself to be because he thinks that's the right thing to do through most of this book. So, grand conclusion there is, I think Flannery O'Connor and this book are convinced of the divine power of children. Prove me wrong. It's better to be an adult, and whatever that means, better to be a child, and whatever that means, than to be an adult. Okay, we're shifting now into things things I think I know. Okay. Let me shift for a moment to a little bit more about Old Tarwater. One things that we talked about for a long time today in Eatonton was that he's a moonshiner. And I've been persuaded by an article that Bob Donahue wrote some years ago that the Van Baird Way is in love with moonshining. Everybody ought to make moonshine. Everybody ought to stay drunk on moonshine all the time. It's a way to get to God. I mean, that sounds like a little bit of an exaggeration, but not much. And so, those cocktail glasses that are on top of the refrigerator um, in the main house at Andalusia are a constant reminder to me that no, Flannery was not a teetotaler. She was pretty She was pretty open-minded about that. And you can find moonshine still remains on the property at the farm. I've only seen one, but I've been told that there's more than one still on the grounds at Andalusia. I don't think Regina's out there making moonshine, but I think she knew her employees were doing it, and she tolerated it, as did as did Flannery. Okay, the other thing I want to say about Old Tarwater is this is about the article that Raber writes for a school teacher magazine. Oh, God help us all, a school teacher magazine. What could be worse? Uh, I've always thought she was talking about me when she wrote that part of that book. You know, she was just looking ahead to these people who are going to write school teacher articles about my novels and how do I feel about them. Okay, so Raber writes his article about Old Tower. It's not literary criticism, but metaphorically it is. And he says, what's the terrible thing he says about Old Tarwater? He called himself. Old Tarwater can't get over how terrible it is that Raber would write such a thing. He rejects it, he rejects it, he rejects it. He just gets all emotional whenever he thinks about such a claim. Okay, what's my response to that? Response number one is, well, he called himself. It happens to be true. Some. It's not the whole truth about Old Tarwater. And we don't get to read the article that Raber writes. We just get to hear Old Tarwater's, outraged report about what Raber said about it. Maybe he said, I know the absolute truth. I can pin down every little bit of Old Tarwater, and he's a total phony and evil and pointless and ridiculous, and we should all hate him because he thinks he was called by God and he really just called himself. Well, if that's what he said, sure, Old Tarwater has to reject that, and he and he's right. I mean, in Flannery O'Connor's head, you know, that you can't do that to another human being. She learned that from Hawthorne. The unforgivable sin is to think you know the final answer to somebody else's life, to their soul, to their character. Don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. And to that extent, I'm on Old Tarwater's side there. Okay, back to literary criticism. Um, if Raber were writing a literary critical article about The Violet Buried Away, he would probably say, we got this character here who thinks he was called by God. Really, he's called himself. Is that a terrible piece of literary criticism? And I would say, no, it's fine. So long as Raber, in his literary critical article, is saying, here's one way to read The Violet Buried Away. Here's one way to understand that character. He's somebody who's called himself, but he thinks he's called by God. To me, it's very important that every time every time Old Tarwater tries to boss God around, it doesn't work. God does not cooperate. When Old Tarwater thinks he knows what's about to happen next, it doesn't happen. And I think that's Flannery's way of saying, God is not taking orders from you, fella. You're kidding yourself to some extent. And I say that as that has to be Flannery's attitude, even though she said she agreed with everything Old Tarwater said 100% of the time. Well, no, you don't, Flannery. You're wrong. You don't. You don't understand your own novel. You don't get your own character. You were just in a bad mood that day. Um, Old Tarwater it is at best a big baby. There are moments when he is compared to Bishop. You know, when Tarwater looks at Bishop, he thinks he's seeing old Tarwater again. And I think, that might be the best thing about old Tarwater is that somebody could look at that little baby and say, "Oh, he's old Tarwater still got something in common with this child." Oh. And I'll just go ahead and say, I think Bishop is probably God. I don't think that's that big of a stretch. If you go through the novel just saying, uh, what are all the good things we could say about Bishop? Uh, Without sentimentality, I think I can buy it that Flannery is just making Bishop do all sorts of things right. And he's not letting his highfalutin intellect mess him up in any way. No problem of intellectualism messing up Bishop's life. Okay, onward, upward. Changing the subject again. Let's go back to the devil. Um, John Hawkes, who was a friend of Flannery O'Connor. Let's talk about open-mindedness and different ways to read things. Okay. John Hawkes was a novelist at Brown University who sent Flannery O'Connor his novels and came down to Milledgeville to visit her at the farm. And she wrote a blurb for one of his novels. He read the manuscript of this novel and used a blue pencil to tell her what to do to it. I don't think she took that much of his advice, but and then he wrote an article called Flannery O'Connor's Devil, in which he said, Flannery O'Connor thinks she's on God's side, but she's really on the devil's side. Why? Because, simplifying a very complicated argument, because Flannery's having too much fun ripping her characters to shreds. She's all about destruction and ridicule and criticism and being negative. And that's the voice of the devil, says John Hawkes. Now, you might think that Flannery O'Connor would read this article and say, goodbye, John Hawkes. That's the end of our relationship. You have crossed the line with me. No, she said. Well, this is really interesting, and I'm really glad that you published that. You don't understand the devil, but it's a really interesting reading of my stuff, and I'm glad it was published. And then she wrote John Hawkes a letter after she rewrote The Violet Buried Away and turned it into a short story called The Lame Shall Enter First. And she said to John Hawkes, in this one, I'll agree that the devil's voice is my own. Okay, go back to the battle between Rayber and Old Tarwater um, about the school teacher article that Rayber wrote. Yeah, they're both probably pretty narrow-minded. Flannery is a lot more open-minded than that. She can read a scholarly article that says her work is pro-devil and say, oh, that's interesting. I'll try writing a story that's like that. So that's a test for everybody, for someday when you're in the mood. Go read The Lame Shall Enter First and see if it makes any sense to you to say that the devil's voice, that her voice is the devil's in that story. And if you're persuaded of that, then you go back to The Violet Buried Away and see if that changes how you read this novel. I think, Flannery has a lot of convictions and strong opinions, and she's a real thinker, and, she's got all these commitments. but she's also open-minded to seeing things in lots of ways because she's a writer. And I think, yeah, she's much more open-minded than either Old Tarwater or Rayber. And that's part of why that battle takes place between those two characters, because they're both rather close-minded. And things are more ambiguous, things are more mysterious than that. Go back to the introduction to the second edition of Wise Blood and see Flannery saying, all you can ask a novel to do is to make the mysteries deeper. I'm not going to give you solutions to problems when I write a novel. I'm just going to show you how complicated it is to try to understand what's going on with people and what freedom means. Okay, I see we're probably almost out of time and I should get on to some other stuff. Okay, let me just tick through them real quick because I got to get around to why O'Connor's cheating. One of the themes of the book in the early pages is young Tarwater making a distinction between actions and words. Everybody else around him he thinks is all talk, all talk, all talk, but he will act. And he thinks he's superior to all the other characters because he can take action. Okay, that's an issue that this book is dealing with. Is Tarwater right? And I would say when you get to the second half of the novel, for May 14th, think about whether Flannery has resolved that issue. I think if she has, she does it through the concept of baptism, which, you say words that are constitute a significant act at the same time. And it may be that words and actions are finally a false distinction, and you can bring them together. Okay, another way to look at this novel, going down my list here. Okay, when I was studying drama a lot, I ran across, and I don't know where, the concept of the sundered protagonist, which just basically says, in some works, it makes sense to think all the characters are really the same character. You just take one personality and you chop it up into a little bunch of pieces and you let them battle with each other. And by the time you get through, reading about them all for hundreds of pages, you understand one person's outlook. It might be the author, might be somebody else. I find that concept very applicable to the Violent Bear Way. I think that Old Tarwater is young Tarwater, and they're both Rayber, and they're all Bishop. And, nobody admits it. Nobody thinks that they have that much in common with the other characters. But I think that's one way to make sense of a whole bunch of stuff that's going on in this book, to see them as characters who just don't want to admit that they really have a lot in common with the people they think they are totally different from. And that business about all of them being compared to idiots is to me, a good starting point for saying that they're all the same person. Okay, one more thing, and then we'll get to why Flannery O'Connor's cheating. Page 396. Here's a passage I want you to think about for when you finish this book. It's something that Flannery O'Connor doesn't do very often, and to me that makes it more significant, not less. It's a flash forward. Bottom of page 396 in the Library of America edition. It's I don't know, another complicated thing, but I think I understand it. An insight came to him. Now we're talking about Rayber. He's puzzling over Tarwater at this moment. An insight came to him that he was not to question until the end. Now, when is that? I think it's after the novel is over and some time has passed. He, Raber understood that the boy Tarwater was held in bondage by his great uncle, that he suffered a terrible false guilt for burning and not burying him. And he saw that he was engaged in a desperate, heroic struggle to free himself from the old man's ghostly grasp. Okay, that's an insight Raber has. There are people who read the whole novel as if that insight he's having right there is correct. But we're being told that later Raber will decide he misread Tarwater. And my, two-bit version of what is Raber going to figure out later is that Tarwater's sincere. Tarwater's for real. Tarwater really wants to get back in touch with old Tar. The rebellion is what's funny. That he's really in love with God, and that the rebellion is not what he thinks it is at this moment. So he's getting a moment of insight, and the rest of the novel is going to prove that wrong. And we're being told on page 396 that after the novel's over, Raber is going to change his mind about long after Raber has been abandoned as a character in this novel. He's going to have these thoughts that we never quite get to see him have, where he's rethinking everything that's been going on. This is a kind of narration that we don't expect from Flannery O'Connor. And notice later on in the novel, we're going to have the same scene told twice. Flannery doesn't do that anyplace else ever in what she writes. Same scene happening twice from two points of view. Okay. Okay, I got 4 minutes to tell you about why Flannery O'Connor is cheating. Okay, she's trying to solve the problem of evil. She's trying to show why Ivan Karamazov is wrong, thinking that God is bad because how could he allow bad things to happen to children? What kind of just God would do such a thing? When I get to page 416, the last page assigned for today, this is how I decided to divide the book up, actually. We get the scene where after Tarwater and Raber go to see Lucette, and Raber is in his pajamas and has been walking barefoot through the city streets, and he has been publicly cursed by the child evangelist, and he's miserable, and he's having to deal with Tarwater, who is never a bowl of cherries. He comes back, and we are told Tarwater walked slightly behind him, and Raber did not cast a glance back at him. His fury seemed to be stirring from buried depths that had lain quiet for years and to be working upward closer and closer toward the slender roots of his peace. When they reached the house, he went in, this is Raber, and straight to his bed without turning to look at the boy's white face, which, drained but expectant, lingered a moment at the threshold of his door as if waiting for an invitation to enter. My interpretation of that is Raber's bad because he's not always loving to children. What Yvonne is wrong about is that he's not always loving towards children. And, people like that aren't consistent. Sometimes they make a big deal about caring about children, but not enough. They're not perfect, and therefore, we don't have to take them seriously. I don't think that's good enough. I try to visualize this thing. What would have happened if Raber had gone into Tarwater's room and said, let's talk about everything now. Why don't you pour your heart out to me and I'll tell you about how I feel about everything in the world? What good's going to come of that? I would say, first of all, I can't imagine that this would happen, and I can't imagine it would work. I think it's false somehow. I think Flannery's playing gotcha for just a moment. And to me, it's Flannery admitting I can't solve this. That's why it takes her 5 years to finish the Raber section of this novel. And it just doesn't quite work the way I wanted, the way I would like for it to. Now, I love Flannery O'Connor. I think this is a great novel. I, you know, um, but I'm gonna make that one little, um, you know, negative remark about her. I was watching on YouTube the other day a lecture by David Brooks, the political commentator, speaking at Yale, an hour-long lecture, which he gave recently about how are we going to save the world? And he goes through the whole history of America and how we got in such a mess. And his answer, how we're going to save the world, is we're going to get together and we're going to talk about um, people in the humanities, spiritual leaders, and creative people whom we really admire. And that's our best bet for saving our um, messed up, damaged country. And I thought, I listened to David Brooks and I said, well, that's why we have book club. You know, this is what we should do. And he didn't say we should find fault with our heroes. So I immediately say, okay, I'm just going to pick at Flannery a little bit, and then I'll be happy to shift back into this is really a great novel, and I would say underrated. And there are all sorts of things about it that I think demonstrate um, the power of literature, and and so on and so on and so on. And maybe, someday the light bulb will go on and I will understand why this is the perfect way for her to end chapter 5. And, and I'll add this about that. This is something for you to test next time. I'm persuaded that Flannery finally saves Raber's soul. And so maybe that's why this little tack on Raber isn't that serious, even if it is unfair, that she maybe doesn't end up thinking that he's so bad after all. And maybe she doesn't think Ivan Karamazov is so evil in the Brothers Karamazov, even though he is, a real rebel against God in Dostoevsky. So I hope I have confused you totally and given you lots of things to think about as you read the rest of this novel. And I think you will still find that there are plenty of surprises coming. Um, I've made some assertions about Bishop tonight that are a little extreme, but I will say when you get to the crucial final pages about Bishop, I will say slow down and read those passages about Bishop over and over and see if you don't um, find that he is very important to how this novel turns out, and that he is controlling events to an impossible degree. I'm almost tempted to say Bishop is the hero of the novel, and one of the reasons I really like the book. Um, it's it's almost impossible to dislike Bishop, I would say. Okay, we're out of time, so nobody can ask any questions. We'll just declare victory now, and I hope to see you all. You've only got like what 3 weeks to finish the other chapters and think of what you want to say about the whole book that everybody should think about. I gave myself the job today of just saying a lot of things that were worth thinking about if you're rereading the novel now. And I appreciate looking at most of you as bibble on at you, and we'll see you. We'll see you in a few weeks. Okay. Yes, saving the world one book at a time. That's exactly right. That's what our job is, folks, and keep doing it. Okay. Y'all take care.
Bye bye.
Thank
See
you, Bruce. Thanks
you.
everybody for
Good night.
coming.